Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the American Center. First, I just wanted to say a few words. I've been coming to India. I first came here in 1995. I had a previous assignment in Calcutta from 2007 to 2010. And in my travels as a diplomat and as a person, I've been to about 50 countries in the world. And one thing that struck me more than any of the other countries is the specialness of India. 1.3 billion people. Every religion is here. How many different languages? You look on the back of a rupee note, there's at least 10 official languages listed there, all kinds of food, all kinds of music and culture. It's such a deep, rich country. And sometimes I'm amazed how it all holds together. But I attribute that, in large part, to your Constitution. India is a remarkable example to the world about how to do democracy on a big scale. And so we're here today to talk about constitutions. I want to wish all the Indians happy Republic Day in advance, which is coming up this Sunday, January 26th. And as I mentioned, we have two notable speakers here today. I'll introduce them both before I sit down. First is our Consul General, Robert Burgess. He's been in Chennai for 2.5 years, and I know a little bit about him outside the office, and a few things I know about him are he has a background in law, and he also has a profound interest and expertise in legal matters. Sir, I would consider you in some small degree an expert on the U.S. Constitution. Last year, we had a debate competition, a U.S.-India comparative debate constitution that was here in South India. We had 4 preliminary rounds at cities across South India, in each state, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Kerala. And it culminated here in Chennai in September for a final debate competition. And I had met Mr. Raghavan, I believe it was in Bangalore. Yes, I was going to say Trichy, but yes, in Bangalore. And I really enjoyed your lecture at that time. Just a quick note here. You'll see photographers here. We like to put something about our events on social media. So a few notes on that. First, if you don't want your photo featured on social media, that's perfectly fine in your freedom. But I would just ask if you wouldn't mind indicating that to our photographers so we'll make sure that we don't publish you on our social media. On that note, too, please remove your visitors' badges. I know we just gave them to you, but we're asking you to remove them. But hang on to them, please. You'll need them when you leave the building, because if you lose them, you have to stay here. So that's we will feed you. In fact, we do have some snacks afterward. So yes. Yeah, so for the purposes of photography, that's why we've asked you to remove your badges. And these days, if there's not a photo and if it's not posted on social media, it didn't happen. So we have to take these photos and document it. But anyway, I was noting that our Consul General has a great interest in the Constitution based on his background before he was a diplomat, as well as his current capacity as our Consul General. Our other resource person today is Mr. Vikram Raghavan. He's here today. He works as a lawyer for the World Bank in Washington, D.C. He advises on a range of issues, including conflict, refugees, and macroeconomics. He provides legal advice about a range of subjects, including military coups, United Nations sanctions, debt relief, and loan conditionality. During his initial years at the World Bank, he worked on issues related to Sri Lanka, Nepal, and later Afghanistan and Iraq. In 1997, Mr. Raghavan graduated from the National Law School of India University in Bengaluru, where he earned 8 gold medals. He pursued his master's degree from New York University and worked as an attorney at O'Melveny and Myers, an international law firm in New York City. He's the author of Communication Law in India and is the founder of a blog called Law and Other Things. Mr. Raghavan has also co-edited a volume of essays entitled Comparative Constitutionalism in South Asia, and edited and introduced George Gadbois' long-lost classic, Supreme Court of India, The Beginnings. Mr. Raghavan maintains an active interest in Indian history and constitutional law and is working on a book about how India became a republic. But before we hear from Mr. Raghavan, I would like to invite our Consul General, Robert Burgess, to give a few remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mullik. And it's great to see such a distinguished audience here for today's program. But I want to correct one thing that Mullik said. I'm not here as a co-resource person. And Mr. Vikram Raghavan is not here as a co-resource person. We're here to hear his insights on the making of the Indian Constitution, and I greatly look forward to that. But Mullik was quite correct in that I am a fan of the American Constitution and constitutional order and what it means in our history. And I think that the comparisons and the influences are quite relevant, and maybe even more relevant today as we look at the meanings of our constitutions and the rights guaranteed under them. I want to congratulate our public affairs section for coming up with the idea of the Comparative Law Program, which saw over 300 students in South India participate in the program, which was called This House Believes That, a U.S.-India Comparative Constitutional Law Debate, which was several rounds in Karnataka, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu, not just with law students, but from students across disciplines. And I know Dr. Raghavan also contributed to that process, contributed his expertise and insights. And to me, that brought just great joy to see so many students so engaged on these topics and debates, and so enlightening to hear them speak. I was at an event a week ago, which involved a number of very distinguished senior officials and former officials from the India foreign policy and security establishment. One message amongst many topics discussed in talking about India today was urging the students there, the younger people, to go back and read India's constitutional law debates, which were all published at the time of the making of the Constitution, for a better understanding of the compromises made, the ideas involved, and what it took to craft a republic out of a land of so many states, so many languages, different religions, and different backgrounds. You know, James Madison is considered the father of the American Constitution. He made a very active study of systems of governance around the world and going back through history. Thomas Jefferson, who was then our ambassador in Paris, this is before the Constitution but after the Revolution, sent him cartons and cartons of books that he bought from booksellers in Paris on history, on Roman law, on Greek democracy, on different historical studies. And in his library at his home, he made an extensive study of the experiences of system of governance, trying to pull the best from history in crafting a new American Constitution. Now, he didn't do this alone, but he brought forth the best practices. And I think, and not to presume your remarks, but I think Dr. Ambedkar and B.N. Rao and the other crafters of the Indian Constitution also made a very concerted effort to look around the world at different constitutions and systems of governance and draw out the very best practices, the very best ideas when they put together the Constitution for the Indian Republic. I'll make one other, just one other note on the similarities of our Constitution, and again, not to presume your remarks. But both the American and Indian constitutions begin in their preambles with the words, "We the people." And those words were very carefully chosen and really quite revolutionary at the time of the American Constitution and still immensely significant today. Because what those words mean is that sovereignty, the right to govern, derives from the people, from the consent of the governed. It's the people who are in charge and grant to governments the power to rule. There's a lot that goes with it, but not every system of government works under that rule or that assumption. And I think that's one thing that sets democracies apart. And our constitutions enshrine these liberal ideas of consent of the governed, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, a constitutional order, and rule of law. These are still significant and important ideas. So with that, I'll be happy to sit down and let Dr. Raghavan proceed. I am already intrigued with Justice Frankfurter and President Roosevelt on the screen. So thank you all.
Thank you, Consul General Burgess. I would now like to invite Mr. Raghavan for his lecture. Sir, before we begin, I'll just present to you a token of our appreciation. Thank you very much for your time here today.
I just want to make sure I can see what I'm clicking. Okay. So, thank you, Consul General Burgess. That was very kind remarks, including a honorary PhD you conferred on me without having to do any work, for which I'm very grateful. I just had my high school teacher who told me you should do a PhD, but I've just got one from the Consul General, no less. Thank you for having me here, and I want to thank all your staff, Lauren Lovelace, Malik Barkana, Usha Davalur, who has worked tirelessly on this event. When she came to see me, when she was at the State Department, I suggested this to her gratuitously, and she's taken me up on it. And Prem, and all your other colleagues who I know are unsung in certain of these events, and so thank you to all of you. I wanted to also clarify, not only do I not have a PhD, I am here not as a lecturer or co-resource person, or as a lawyer for the organization whose name you did not hear, but more as a student of Indian and American constitutional law and history, which I think you are too, in some sense, from reading your bio, and I think it's particularly appropriate, therefore, we have you here in the audience, but also all the Friends of the American Center, which I know you work very hard on building those relations. My friends, old and new, my family, but I also wanted to sort of acknowledge two people. One person is not here, Mr. Mutaya. He did more than anyone else to nurture my interest in history. I actually only met him after he passed his 85th year. But it was the last 3 years of his life that our friendship really took off, and I did an oral history with him. And I think that the one event that I always missed his talks because I live in Washington, but the one event which he did in our home was a talk about Madras's connections with the United States. I recorded that event, and I'm going to sort of give it to Usha because I do think it deserves to be displayed. I have the slides for it, but also his voice, which, as many of Mutaya's friends in the audience know, is inimitable voice, right? The second person I wanted to thank or to acknowledge is my public speaking teacher, Sumati Narayan. I don't think you can be in your hometown and have your high school teacher in the audience. No one gave me more confidence to speak than her, so I think it's particularly an honor to have your high school teacher with you. And thank you to you for allowing me to do that. With that out of the way, I thought we can, this is more a conversation, but obviously I have a slideshow. Do you want to dim the lights, or maybe will that, can you see it? Because some of the slides might be a little, yeah? Yeah? Okay, well, we can decide how it, I don't want you to get a headache. But we begin with King George V, King George VI, actually, is representative in India, Viceroy Wavell, who convenes the Constituent Assembly in December 1946 as Britain prepares to leave India. Here you see the Viceroy, actually someone writing on behalf of the Viceroy, commanding members of the newly elected Constituent Assembly to come to Delhi for the first meeting of this body. Most of the Assembly's members had been indirectly elected. In fact, Madras sent the largest contingent, 43. And their task was to draft a constitution for the soon-to-be independent Dominion. They convened in what is now Parliament House. It used to be called the Council House. And in the central chamber, which was a hastily rearranged library, they met on the 9th of December, a Monday at 11 a.m. This city has a lot of trivia nerds and quiz types. It was the same day that Sonia Gandhi was born in Italy. No connection, but that's what quiz is about, right? So this gathering constituted a team of rivals, as the American author Doris Kearns Goodwin would say, right? Because they really were a very diverse bunch of men and women. And they got together to draft the world's longest constitution. And like the American founding fathers, whom the Consul General just mentioned, they studied, like Madison, the republics of Rome and Greece, and looked to the constitutional practices and principles of many countries in order to frame the Indian Constitution. Naturally, the United States was an early port of call. So in his book, Cornerstone of the Nation, I was trying to get a copy, and so I think that's one recommendation I would leave, that this library have a copy. The great American historian Granville Austin has done sort of a monumental task for us as Indians, but also for his fellow citizens in America, to chronicle the making of the Indian Constitution. And that book, which is The Indian Constitution, A Cornerstone of a Nation, is in a way the most authentic, detailed account of the making of the Indian Constitution. And in Austin's book, Austin remarks that the example of the U.S. Constitution drafting its Constitution, the United States drafting its Constitution right after independence was very strong in the mind of the Indian leaders. Right? So minutes after he gavels the proceedings to order, the Assembly's first chairperson, Sachidhananda Sinha, quite old because he was sort of the senior most member, having served in the Imperial Council in the 1905, and so he was in a way the most the wisest of the wise people in the Assembly. But he took the chair, and the first thing he did was to read out a message of solidarity from U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, famous lawyer, but also a great friend of India. And Acheson said in his message that he hoped he wished the people of India well, and said that the Assembly's deliberations would be watched with deep interest by freedom-loving people throughout an entire world. Putting aside Acheson's telegram, Sinha continued and counseled the members to pay greater attention to the American Constitution, not for wholesale adaptation, but for judicial adoption. Now, Sinha's interest reflected a much deeper historical and intellectual bond between America and India. And one can go back to so here you see a copy of his the proceedings, and you can see him reading out the letter from Acheson, but also his invocation to the United States. But we go back to the beginning of the age of modern Indian liberalism with Raja Ram Mohan Roy, which itself comes of age roughly as the American Republic is emerging, the American Revolutionary War takes place. And so early Indian liberals like Roy were conversant with American politics. In fact, Roy claimed he was a Federalist and viewed the East India Company as a federal unit. And he was particularly concerned with the economic drain carried out by the colonial rulers. In fact, in one of his letters to the King Emperor, Roy boldly remarks that the Americans were driven to rebellion by the misgovernment on part of the British rulers in America, and he subtly warns that might happen in India too. Right now, whether that letter reached or was read, I don't know. But the generation that followed Roy was deeply influenced by people like Thomas Paine, as well as some of the other revolutionary ideologues from both America and France. Now, as the national movement gathers steam, the Congress Party's early leaders, convening in Bombay and then going across the country every year for an annual session, celebrate American constitutional law and principles by drawing upon them in their speeches and in their canvassing. Right? And one of the things that they are particularly encouraged is President Woodrow Wilson, who, sort of great peacenik, comes out with these 14 points of self-determination, right? I mean, he was sort of critical in the Treaty of Versailles to end the First World War. And Wilson's 14 points really strike a chord among the fledgling Indian national movement, who think that this also speaks to them, this idea, that Wilsonian idea of self-determination. One of these people who was so inspired was Bal Gangadhar Tilak, the great Indian revolutionary leader, but also a constitutionalist. In fact, he was the author of the first nationalist constitution, which draws heavily from the United States and the Brazilian constitutions. Remarkable document because it contains provisions like equality, free speech, even privacy, a right which has only just been recognized as a fundamental right by the Supreme Court in the last 2 years. Now, we can go on, but we have to move on, which is that in 1930, a Congress committee led by the distinguished lawyer Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru's father, submits detailed proposals for self-rule. And this Nehru report, as it's called, is very interesting because of how much it borrows from the United States. Among other things, Motilal Nehru proposes that there are to be 2 houses of parliament, the Senate and the House of Representatives. He just takes those names. And he also included, interestingly, a right to bear arms. Now, interestingly, that provision was taken off, and we can discuss the wisdom offline. But what is also striking is that the Nehru report contains 10 fundamental rights, which Austin tells us later are directly taken and put into our Constitution when it is adopted in 1950. So this is very important. Now, motivated, of course, sort of shifting from India to what was happening in the United States, motivated by what they saw and they heard in the sort of in the United States. I don't know why okay, yeah, here it is. Motivated by what they saw and heard about Gandhi, prominent Americans sort of lobbied their government to help the nationalist cause. Because, Gandhi had appeared on the Time magazine, the New York Times was covering it. He was, there were these silent movie reels that were available. And so what had always been this land that, the occasional American traveler had described as exotic really came alive. And the nationalist struggle really made, sort of struck a chord with the American people in the 1930s. Also what happens is that in 1930, at the historic Lahore Congress, Jawaharlal Nehru moves the Purna Swaraj resolution, the Declaration for Complete Independence, and it borrows, very strikingly borrows, from the American Declaration of Independence. In fact, I think Rajmohan Gandhi has written a whole book comparing the 2 documents. And you can see, just as the American Declaration of Independence makes all these, let's say, accusations against the king, King Shah III, the Indian Declaration of Independence tries to do the same against the British rulers. We have to move on, which is to Borneo and to basically the Japanese advance over East Asia. Singapore falls, Rangoon falls, right? And this really sends alarm bells in the State Department and with President FDR, who sort of really fights the war looking at his stamp collection, but also watches with horror as the Japanese advance on what they thought would be this domino could not fall, India, right? And so the American administration fears that if the Japanese armies overrun Indian borders, just as they did with other countries in East Asia, that would be the end of the war in Asia. And it was quickly apparent to American policymakers that the Allies badly needed the Indian people's cooperation if the Japanese had to be halted. This meant it was clear to FDR that Britain would have to make significant concessions, including a roadmap for independence after the war. During this time, the American administration or the American policymakers were also lobbied by many private citizens. And we can go on and on about all these early friends of India, but one person stands out, Pearl Buck, the famous author, and she writes this interesting letter actually to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was, as you know, the very powerful, first lady, where Buck tells Eleanor Roosevelt, there's the suppression of the Indian people, and if you don't, if the British don't watch it, they're really going to be massacred, right? Sort of an alarmist letter, but it also is sort of to attract attention to the Indian cause. Roosevelt happens to leave it out on a table where the president walks by. He takes a look at it, and President Roosevelt is obviously greatly alarmed by what he reads. The administration also comes under a lot of pressure from the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, who visits India and then sort of travels to the United States. And he reports to President Roosevelt that the political situation would not improve unless the British really give Indians real power. So in March 1942, President Roosevelt, who, as you know, shared a very close relationship with his friend, the Prime Minister. This is in code, and you can see the nicknames they had for each other, so that to confuse German sort of intelligence. But Roosevelt writes to Churchill, who, remember, his mother was American, so he always thought he was half American, Churchill, and sort of drew upon that when he wanted. And so President Roosevelt pours scorn on the British position vis-a-vis India, and he delivers an extraordinary lecture to the Prime Minister on American history, beginning with the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, to say that, look, Americans went through this struggle and came out successfully, and it is important for the British to recognize the true constitutional aspirations of the Indian people. He even suggests, this is an extraordinary letter, it's available on the Roosevelt Presidential Library, and he even suggests that the Indians could be trusted with some sort of Articles of Confederacy approach, which is really, the sort of the interim phase for the United States after they became independent and before they adopted a constitution in 1787. So Roosevelt says, why not try that for India too, just as we had sort of this interim phase. Now, Churchill was not amused by this missive, and he threatens to resign, and so Roosevelt does not push him further publicly. But what Roosevelt does is to do everything he can to basically reach out to the nationalist movement, and in 1942, he appoints former Assistant Secretary of War, Lewis Johnson, as his personal representative to India. Now, this does not go down well in Delhi. The Viceroy wonders why Roosevelt sends a personal representative to British India. And to the surprise and dismay of the Viceroy and his advisors, Johnson works actively to try and achieve a political settlement. All of this is described by a great former State Department diplomat who served in Madras between 1960 and 62. Kux is his name, K-U-X. Great book, which describes in a way this sort of early sort of U.S. involvement behind the scenes. Now, we have to move on, which is after the war ends, a Labour government comes to power, and Prime Minister Attlee, the new Prime Minister who surprisingly defeats Churchill in the elections, he decides to jumpstart negotiations and transfer power to India, and so he sends 3 of his senior cabinet colleagues on a cabinet mission to India to decide what would be the subcontinent's new constitutional status. But so one of the plans they came up, the cabinet mission plan, was to basically try and keep the country united with 3 sets of constitutions. I won't go into the details, but this was not acceptable to the Muslim League. And eventually Gandhi and Nehru and the Congress colleagues reluctantly agreed to the partition of the country. So in August 1947, two dominions come into being, India and Pakistan, and after independence, the Constituent Assembly gets down to the task of drafting the constitution for the newly independent country. So one of the first things it does, it appoints a drafting committee. And this committee includes Sir Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, whose home is not too far from here, from Madras. And it includes some of the other greats. Dr. Ambedkar chairs the drafting committee, and he does much of the heavy lifting. In fact, I think we don't realize how much of an influence Dr. Ambedkar plays, because his interventions on the floor of the assembly are important, but also behind the scenes in marking up Sir B.N. Rao's draft, but also sort of being the gatekeeper. Every time there were 7,000 amendments proposed, and it was Ambedkar who basically decided yes or no, and the presiding officer asked Dr. Ambedkar yes or no. If he said yes, the assembly largely voted yes, and if he said no, the amendment was killed. So that, I think, is also it's a sort of an unseen, unstated role that Ambedkar plays. Now, of course, Dr. Ambedkar is also one of the few, in fact, probably the only founder who actually studies in the United States, graduated with distinction from Columbia University, and was a student of John Dewey of Columbia, right? And in a way, I always tell my American audiences, a former untouchable or Dalit in the assembly, Dr. Ambedkar's presence is so revolutionary. Just imagine what it would have been like if Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been invited to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, right? So that is even the significance, and it's more than just symbolism. Now, assisting, of course, Dr. Ambedkar was the Assembly's advisor, Sir B.N. Rao, who the Consul General referred to earlier. And B.N. Rao was someone who, he was a very interesting man, a judge and a civil servant, but he was also very learned in American law. And so, among other things, he writes many memos to assembly members to prepare them for the debates, just as the American founders sort of, when they gathered, when they came to Annapolis and then later to Philadelphia, they did a lot of reading, right? They stacked their homes with books of the classics, and you can see that in the Library of Congress when you see their libraries on display. And so something similar happens here. TTK buys a whole library of constitutional law books, but B.N. Rao decides that he will supply to every member, whether they like it or not, reading material. And so he puts together these 3 volumes of constitutional precedents where he draws upon American practice and institutions and case law to show the Indians what is possible in terms of constitutional design. Now, what is more is that, so here's a copy of one of the Rao memos, right, which talks about, sort of voting, I think. Now, a few months into the drafting process, Rao travels on what my organization would call a study tour. He's sent to the United States to basically meet various dignitaries. And so in New York, Rao meets the legendary Justice Learned Hand. He never made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. He sat on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, but one of the great names in law. And Learned Hand, interestingly, tells Rao, because Rao takes a copy of the draft constitution. This is November 1947. They have a rough draft around October, and so he carries it with him to show the American leaders. And so Hand takes a look at it and tells Rao, well, I see all these fundamental rights, but my experience is that they're better as moral precepts rather than legally enforceable principles. Now, it's interesting when I tell American audiences, and they're a little shocked that this great American icon, now whether that's true or not, but Rao, of course, records it faithfully. The history is that suggestion was taken, but we decided to have rights that can be enforceable. Now, in Washington, Rao calls on Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. Frankfurter is a great judge, lots of books written on him. And Frankfurter was forthright. He's actually very interested in India, sort of writes to the Indian ambassador for many years asking for information about India. And so Frankfurter readily agrees to see Rao and advises him, please avoid all the mistakes of the American Constitution, of which there are many. In fact, a decade before, Frankfurter had watched how a conservative Supreme Court had struck down many of the New Deal programs of the FDR administration, right? So he was convinced that judges should not be given the power to veto legislation duly enacted by the people's representatives in Congress or the state legislatures, right? And so relying on Frankfurter's advice, Rao comes back home and tweaks the draft wording of the Constitution. Very remarkable change made, right? Because they wanted to basically provide US-style due process. And Frankfurter says that's not going to work. We've had a hell of a time with it in the United States. So they borrow the Japanese Constitution, which interestingly is also drafted by American military lawyers. These were not Japanese drafting a constitution like India. Anyway, they borrowed the Japanese Constitution. So for all those who claim ours is an entirely Western constitution, not true. Key provision drafted from Japan, but largely inspired by Frankfurter, who says, don't put due process, you're going to ask for big trouble, right? Now, what is also very interesting is that Rao manages to do something most remarkable at the urgings of the Indian ambassador, Sir Girija Shankar Bajpai. He gets an appointment with President Truman. Here is a copy from the Truman Presidential Library that I managed to get because I wanted to make sure it was actually true. And the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri or Kansas, I forget where it is, Missouri, basically sent me a copy, and it says, meeting with the Indian ambassador. I think the whole, I can't read it here, but it is quite interesting the way they describe it to the president, right? What I think is fascinating that this is, nation building was 4 decades away. But the President of the United States takes time out of his schedule to meet the draftsman of the Indian Constitution, right? Quite a remarkable feat. And this is, and India is not even independent yet. We don't even have diplomatic relations with the United States, right? Now, during this short meeting, Truman tells Rao, whatever you may do and borrow from our Constitution, do not copy our provision for midterm elections. Yes. So you'll wonder why, right? Because even before they sit down, Truman very quickly says this, right? What Truman was referring to was the House of Representatives 2 years, right? Every 2 years you have an election cycle, right? And of course, Truman had just been burnt in the 1946 midterms when the Republicans gained 55 House seats and 12 Senate seats, enough to give them control of both houses of Congress, first time after several decades. And Truman was obviously feeling the slight. So, Rao says, yes, we were going to have 5 years. Don't worry. Truman then, Rao tells Truman, well, I'm also interested and intrigued by your decision to appoint a committee on civil rights. I think this is very interesting because it's often forgotten. This committee on civil rights, which of course predates the American civil rights legislation or the civil rights movement, by decades, is one of Truman's sort of unsung contributions, is noticed in India. And Rao says that we will borrow that and include in our Constitution a provision for a commission on backward classes. And so I think there's Article 356, 370, it's about 365 or something like that. I forget the number. That is really inspired by the American Civil Rights Committee that Truman appointed. At the end of the meeting, Truman tells Rao, well, I'm greatly impressed and interested, and please send me a copy of the Indian Constitution, and then add sort of mischievously, I might like to borrow a point or two from India for the future, right? Now, of course, in India, not everyone shared this enthusiasm about America. In fact, Prime Minister Nehru was a longtime skeptic. He pointed to, I don't think he had yet visited the United States by then. His first visit, I think, is much later. But he points to the fact that the US Constitution represents 18th century ideas. Why should we, he says openly, it's hardly reasonable for India to borrow liberally from it in the middle of the 20th century. But Nehru's warning does little to stop citations to and references from American constitutional law and practice in the Assembly. You can see the debates are riddled with them. It would take more than a morning or an evening or a day, probably several days, to fully appreciate every lesson or experience that India's founders gained from America. So let us look at 2 or 3 features before we sort of wind this up. First, as you all know, in fact, it's interesting, when I've done this talk previously, I have to say, well, everyone knows we the people in both preambles. And then what I usually do is I take people through the preamble. But we now live in this historic time whatever your view might be on what's happening, I think it's heartening that more Indians have downloaded the preamble and read it, right? And so I keep saying this to both conservatives and liberals, that is something we must celebrate, and both agree, right? And so here is a photo I just took, actually from a law school in Gujarat, which, before the present controversy, had dedicated a whole wall to the preamble. So obviously we have the preambular commonalities, where both the US and the Indian constitutions, you can see the US in influence, the idea that the Indian people are the basis of all sovereignty. That was something that Nehru particularly wanted. He did not want to give the impression that the constitution was a product of a body that was called by a viceroy. He really felt that the Indian people should own this, and so all legitimacy for the modern republic derives from a free and sovereign people. But it was also to underscore the fact that there was popular acceptance of this constitution, ratified, of course, in the first general elections of 1952, and it was not, therefore, the product of a small elite, right? Now, it is also interesting that there is no reference in the preamble to an Indian blood, or an Indian race, or an Indian geography, or an Indian religion, and in that dispassion, in a way, also comes from the United States. Now, of course, we also have similarities in the sense we have a strong and robust Bill of Rights. Again, this comparison can take forever, but India's founders believed that a Bill of Rights would help the new country confront the staggering challenges, especially of caste and social-based discrimination. And so if we look at the resulting Indian provisions, I don't like to inflict legal provisions on the lawyer, on non-lawyers or even lawyers, but very quickly, if we look at Article 14, which strikingly has the same number as the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, Article 14 of the Indian Constitution, which telescopes sort of the British provision of equality with American equal treatment, is in a way this important assertion that all Indians are equal and basically have equality before the law and equal protection, right? Now, the Constitution just doesn't stop there. In fact, it goes beyond what the American Constitution provides in written terms, because Article 15 of our Constitution prohibits in specific terms discrimination on a number of grounds: religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. And these prohibited markers have taken on a meaning. And then, of course, our Constitution includes, through the foresight of Dr. Ambedkar, the provision abolishing untouchability in one sweep. Now, here it is quite remarkable because the Constitution is serving not just as a framework for governance, but really an emancipation proclamation. Right? We never had an emancipation proclamation. And in a way, people question, why is Article 17 sitting in the Bill of Rights? But this is because what rights can you have if you have people who are socially disenfranchised? So I think this is a remarkable provision. The Supreme Court now is sort of looking at this provision to see, well, is it just untouchability in terms of caste? What about other forms of exclusion? Interesting debate. But I do think we must pay homage to the fact that they chose to include an emancipation proclamation in a constitution for it to really have meaning. And that, I think, is a truly Indian innovation. Now, of course, finally on religion, India's founders disfavored open-ended declarations like the First Amendment. The U.S. First Amendment does many things, but among other things, it sort of enjoins Congress from making no law that will abridge the freedom of speech and expression. We don't have something very similar to that, but we basically, freedom of speech and religion. But we have in Article 25, again, an article that was drafted with the involvement of someone from the city, Father Jerome D'Souza of Loyola College. But Article 25 of our Constitution gives every citizen the right to practice, profess, and propagate one's religion, subject to restrictions. And so you see this idea of subject to restrictions hemming in all the other rights, and that was the Indian decision not to have open-ended fundamental rights, right? Now, we can go on, but we should just sort of wrap this up, which basically India becomes a republic on the 26th of January, 1950, the day that we will renew our common constitutional faith as citizens. But that day, the 1950 Republic Day, didn't really stop the export of American constitutional political ideas to India. They kept coming. And somewhat naturally, of course, that process really focuses on the Supreme Court, where there's constantly looking at what other courts and constitutions are doing, right? And so American constitutional law and practice are the subject of close study and analysis in our superior courts, both in the high courts. In fact, one of the leading cases before any of American constitutional law was from the Madras High Court. And so the superior courts of this country have always looked to American constitutional law. And you see, for instance, in the Puttaswamy case, the 9-judge bench, where the right to privacy was basically recognized as a fundamental right for all persons, that most of the justices cite American constitutional law. You even see it in the latest case, which I urge you to download, Anuradha Bhasin's case on the Kashmir mobile internet order. Again, whatever you think of that judgment, you will see it's very interesting how much the judge looks at the American case law on free speech, right? Now, most of this, of course, is a bit of one-way traffic, right? That the U.S. looks at what India looks at what the U.S. is doing, but it is not always the case, as I like to remind many of my American friends. For that, we must pay homage to Justice Douglas, the great environmentalist. Wild Bill is who he was called. In Washington, for those of you who know, there's the P&O Canal. He's the person who saved the P&O Canal when they wanted to fill it up. And he was the great environmental justice from Washington State. Now, Justice Douglas was a great friend of India. In fact, he travels to India in the 50s and delivers a very thoughtful set of essays called We the Judges, from Marshall to Mukherjee. Marshall was the 4th Chief Justice of the United States, and Mukherjee was the 4th Chief Justice of India. And William O. Douglas produces, at a time when nobody was thinking of comparative constitutional law or comparisons, a 400-page book about the comparisons between the Indian and the U.S. constitutions. I don't know if I have a copy. Actually, I didn't put up a photograph. But what is interesting is when he returns from Calcutta, he brings this home and doesn't forget it, because in a case, 1957, Kingsley, the Kingsley case, he basically cites India. And he says, this is a case which I won't bore you with about free speech, and he says in the text of the judgment that, well, our Constitution doesn't have an Indian-type provision. And he said, so if we had an Indian provision, he would have voted a certain way. But what I thought is very interesting is he cites India in an American Supreme Court decision. He even puts a footnote and explains to an American reader why he's citing. And this, I think, is quite remarkable in the American Supreme Court law reports, right? Now, of course, this is only a drop of the ocean. Justices Breyer, Justice Ginsburg have all been interested in India. Justice Ginsburg's written a lengthy piece on gender discrimination and the comparisons. And then, of course, Justice Douglas's enthusiasm to travel to India are also matched by other justices. Justices Scalia and Ginsburg, actually, I think they were in India when 9/11 happened, and they were stranded, and they had to get a special flight to evacuate them, because I was in Washington, I remember that. And I think Justice Ginsburg is very fond of this picture because it's with her and Justice Scalia, and it's been subject to unending interpretations. What I'm suggesting is that this, not every Supreme Court justice is, of course, taken back, in terms of what is jurisprudence, but that's fine, because we are still happy that this, exchange takes place. And so, to just sort of sum this all up, why is this? What are the sort of 3 quick reflections I can offer on this whole this great osmosis, right? So, in one sense, America serves as a convenient reference point for India's founders, who did not want to borrow lock, stock, and barrel from colonial Britain, which did not even have a written constitution, right, to begin with. So when we were making a constitution, obviously that would be a natural reference point. In fact, other countries looked at London, and in fact, between 1950 and 60, no less than 92 constitutions were written by England or by Britain for their colonies. And India is an exception, right? And they chose instead we would look at the United States, because it was the gold standard for making new constitutions. And part of this was obviously because the assembly, while it had politicians, also had very shrewd technocrats. And Dr. Ambedkar, for instance, plays an especially key role with his mastery of American constitutional precedents. But it is important to remember that our Constitution is not just borrowed either from the United States or England. In fact, we had this great founder, Kengal Hanumanthaya, who said, We wanted the music of the veena and sitar, and instead we got the marching of an English band in our constitution. But it was not just an English band, actually there were quite a few others. These are all the different constitutions that basically we borrowed from. And Dr. Ambedkar was said, there's nothing to be ashamed. There are no patents on constitutional ideas. And so, yes, we did take the best from all these different constitutions to create our own, which has taken root and sort of become sort of an indigenous, sort of something that we're proud of, right? So I want to end, though, by why this issue of ideas from abroad, whether they are from law, constitution, politics, matter, right? Not just the US and India. Now, what is very interesting is shortly after Gandhi returns from South Africa in 1921, he publishes an article in his paper, "The Evil Wrought by the English Medium." I don't have a copy, but it's probably in one of these issues. In this article, very interestingly, the Mahatma decides to attack two prominent people we've met before, Ram Manohar Roy and Tilak, right? And Gandhi has, I'd say, somewhat of the audacity to suggest that the two could have achieved a great deal more had they not expressed their thoughts entirely in English. You don't put this past Gandhi, and it was true. Now, so he says this, but from Calcutta, the great sage and poet reads Gandhi's piece with great dismay, right? And he writes back accusing Gandhi of a dangerous form of egotism and says that Roy could have been perfectly natural in his engagements with the West because he enjoyed the full inheritance of Indian wisdom. Gandhi, of course, was hurt by the dressing down he got from the man who actually gave him the title Mahatma. Remember, it was Tagore who gave Gandhi the title Mahatma, right? So the fact he was rebuked by him hurt. And he pointed out to his own friendship. So he wrote like a sort of a rejoinder, and he points to his own close friendships with the Europeans, Kallenbach, for instance. And he sums up his cosmopolitanism in the following memorable words, which are, "I hope I am as great a believer in free speech as the great poet. I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all the lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any of them." So it is this restated position of Gandhian cosmopolitanism is what I submit should broadly animate India's comparative engagements with the United States or other democracies, not just with respect to law or the Constitution, but to the deeper questions that arise from our shared human experiences. Thank you very much.
Mr. Raghavan, thank you very much for your scintillating and erudite presentation. That was great. Let's give him another warm round of applause. So we have about 15 or 20 minutes for question and answer. I'll moderate this session, and I'd invite you to ask Mr. Raghavan any questions you have. Although for the acoustics, you may be able to hear without the microphone. For the purpose of recording, we'll pass the mic. So you have a question up here? Please identify yourself, sir.
Okay. Do I have to introduce myself, or what's the protocol?
Please do. Please identify
Okay, very well. Okay, so first of all, let me say thank you for coming here today. Yep, it's on. Thank you once again for coming here today. A wonderful refresher course in American and Indian history. My name is Manny, by the way, and I've been a patron of this library and the center for quite a few years now, although I've just recently come back over here on a holiday from the US. I finished my time in the US, and I'm hoping to just stay over here for a bit of time and just renew my ties here. And one of the things which struck me near the end of your lecture was the talk of how everyone is granted the freedom of practice of religion subject to restrictions. Everything about your lecture sort of reinforced the idea that governance and law are not sciences, they're art. And they can be subject to interpretation or any kind of manipulation in any way whatsoever. And I think one of the geniuses of India declaring itself a secular state was that especially during the time of partition where the Muslims were greatly affected, and several of them suffered during the partition, having to face a choice between either moving to Pakistan or staying in India. They were given a message that they are Indians, they matter, and they do have a big role to play in society. And that was one of the biggest successes, in my opinion, in ensuring that they were able to stay in India and feel a part of the society, especially with regard to practice of religion. The problem is, the buzzword is restrictions. And I think it's fair to say that several governments over the years in India, especially the more right-wing, more conservative governments, have sought to try to, put some restrictions down. And this is a problem where sometimes if we have a constitution which grants some freedoms but which isn't really ironclad, it can be subject to a lot of manipulation by some people at the top. And we see that with the current controversy being propagated by the Modi government, if you will, where everyone has to be registered. And apparently there is this feeling that, the secularism which was which is India's pride and joy, is now being slowly but surely compromised. And one of the things which our dignitaries can also back me up on is that one of the successes of the American government is that they separate the church from the state. So they're also in every way a beacon of secularity. So I guess I'd like to ask my question. This question would be, how do you perceive this current development, and what are your thoughts on what's going on in India right now and what has been going on for quite some time, maybe?
Maybe we can take a few others. Yeah.
There's a question in the back here. Sir, could you help me pass the mic?
Okay. Hi, I'm David. I'm a student of everything that's happening around. Two quick questions. One is, in your study, has there been any instance where a plagiarism software can actually find out verbatim copy of texts and passages of constitutions and directly using it in the Indian constitution? So that's my first question. Second is, every time we speak about law in India, we have this rhetoric of, we have a tremendous array of dharma shastras and nyaya shastras and texts. So I'm just curious to know, how come all of those countries were used as the basis for our constitution and not any of the shastras that get proclaimed of late? So I'm just curious to know your opinion about that. Thank you.
Should I?
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, no, so it's a thoughtful point you made. I have to say that so much has been out there. I'm not sure I have much to offer. Also remember, I don't live in India. So partly it's a bit irresponsible of me to then offer a view on something that in a way doesn't affect me directly. And also, I think this is a subject which is still evolving. I am still a lawyer, and the matter is just before the court. So we'll see. I'm watching it with interest, like everyone else, as a citizen. I do think, like I said, the one takeaway I have is that more people are reading the Constitution, both on this side and that side, and that to me is what I want to celebrate, especially on Republic Day. Now, your question's an interesting one. On the models, right? So this was heavily debated too, what would be the model? And there are two responses. One is, remember, many of the founders, India's founders, men and women, we had 15 women founders. The founders, many of them had served in provinces under the Government of India Act, including in Madras. There was a Congress-led ministry from 1937 to 1939. Many had been mayors. Rajaji was a mayor of Salem, for instance. Nehru was involved in the Allahabad municipality. So a lot of them had been groomed in this system, right? Prasad, I think, was in the Patna municipality. And several members, the leading lights, of the 20 leading lights of the assembly, I think 11 or 12 had held office in some sense at either the state or local level before the Constitution came into force. Some of them had actually been in central office, because remember, we all forget the Viceroy had a cabinet, and Dr. Ambedkar was a member of that cabinet, as were some of the other founders. This was sort of obviously an imperial cabinet. So the comfort level with a British-style Westminster form of government was high. I think lots of people have raised this issue. In law schools, it's the first question that people ask. Why did we go for a British parliamentary form of government? There are many people who argue every now and then that we should have just had an American presidential form of government. There have been others who say, as I said, the person who said we wanted the music of the veena and the sitar. And then there are also those who feel it should have been a Gandhian constitution. In fact, if you see the photograph I showed you of Nehru, look at the number of Gandhi caps, right? So this was a very Gandhian assembly, yet there are very few Gandhian features in the Constitution, as Granville Austin tells us. Very interesting chapter on Gandhi and the Constitution that Austin writes. In fact, I think there he gets a little overstrident by saying that the Constitution is nothing Gandhian beyond the prohibition provision and the aspiration for panchayats. But actually, this whole issue of Gandhi and the Constitution is a very interesting one, because Gandhi's model was a panchayat-based republic. And Austin, writing in the 60s, says that the assembly, because there were technocrats, they were very much dyed-in-the-wool sort of parliamentarians, rejected it outright. But actually, that's not entirely what's borne out, because remember, we had the amendments to the Constitution to bring back local bodies, both in the rural and urban. So you could argue that's the Gandhian vision that still endured, right? The idea that we would strengthen panchayats. So it is very interesting to see these different sort of models. But at the end of the day, they had to draft a constitution quickly, right? People say it took too long, but it was the world's longest constitution. And again, to all my American friends who say, why? It is the constitution of the union and of the states. If you look at the California state constitution, it can fill up several shelves, right? So ours is the constitution of both the union and of the states. And therefore, it had to be drafted with some sort of, let's say, detail, but also borrowing responsibly.
Yes, a woman in the back, please come forward. Can you come here by the... Okay.
Good afternoon. No.
Just for the recording, for the microphone. Please identify yourself. Excuse me.
First of all, thank you so much for U.S. Consulate to invite us. I'm Jaya. I'm working for Sahodra.
Do you mind stepping forward just because you're not in they can't see you on the video?
Can I stand there?
You have to, yeah,
Okay.
please. Thank you. Thanks, John. Sorry to orchestrate from the seat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. And we need your guidance. Actually, you know very well about transgender issues in India. In 2014, April 15th, Supreme Court has given wonderful historical verdict, that is transgenders or third gender in India. And also they said lots of points about the transgenders empowerment and upliftment. And after that, the Tiruchi Shiva, who is MP of Member of Parliament in the DMK party, Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, he has given wonderful bill, Trans Person Bill 2016, Transgender Person Protection Bill 2016. He was told too many very good points about transgenders empowerment, but after that, the BJP bill, now it is Act, BJP's Transgender Persons Protection Act 2019. It is nothing is there. Nothing is there. We are very suffered and we are very sad about that act. Actually, in 2019, December 5, President has signed that act. What we should do next, because that is too much difference between Supreme Court verdict and BJP act. For example, only one point, the Supreme Court says who is a transgender. Transgender is self-identity is very, very important. Who says I am transgender? Yes, they are transgenders. But that bill says, in case if you are transgender, you go in front of district magistrate and prove yourself. How it is proof? You said that Article 15, Indian Article, Constitution Article 15 says, not discrimination through sex, gender, and place of birth like that. But it is totally against that. What we should do? Please give your guidance. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you for your question. I've been made a doctor twice already, but that doesn't give me the ability to talk on most subjects. And on this one, I have followed the debates, and I know there's a difference of view. I actually have many friends who are involved very closely in the issue. But to be completely honest, it's not an issue that actually I am competent to talk about because I haven't really studied it. I have read Justice Swaminathan, his judgment on transgender marriage, which I urge all of you to read. I think this is an interesting Madurai bench of the Madras High Court, first time case on transgender marriage. And Justice Swaminathan, for those of you who know, is not exactly a radical or a, let's say, someone who's an activist judge. Very conservative judge, has delivered a very thoughtful verdict. So since that judgment is in the public domain, I urge all of citizens of the state to read it because Justice Swaminathan has taken a very interesting view, is what I can say on the issue. And I'm still trying to make my way through that judgment. And the question you raised is obviously important, but it's a little beyond my capacity. Thank you.
I mentioned last year we conducted a comparative constitutional debate, and one of the resource people who helped us out so much was Justice Prabhashri Devan, who's with us here today, right up front, and she has a question.
Thank you very much, Vikram. That was an excellent. This is not a question about your speech, but about something that I saw there. You showed us the picture of Mr. Motilal Nehru's Nehru report, and underneath it said anti-separatist. What was that all about? That's one question. And the other is perhaps an answer to what Mr. David asked. We were in the throes of a religious separation. So maybe that's why they didn't want to look at Shastras, which might give a religious tinge to what we were doing.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I don't know myself, and I don't know if that's the official document. It's the most commonly available. I try to use public sources so I don't violate any copyright, especially in a presentation like this. So it limits the photographs I can show. But that is a downloadable version on archive. Like our Constitution, which public and private copies exist, I think the Motilal Nehru report generated so much fervor, lots of private printers printed it. Because I have a different version of it, which I think is an authentic one, which doesn't have that legend. But I suspect the person who put it, or if that was a different version authorized by the AICC then, was to show that this was not intended to basically call for secession or independence, right? Because this bill, remember, Jinnah was also a member of the committee. They were very much, he was still a constitutionalist, right? They wanted to, I think the idea was very much to argue that in drafting a constitution, they were not thinking of Purna Swaraj at that, because it's only after that was, it's only 2 years later they come to this idea of complete independence. This is a time that the British are toying with giving India dominion status. If you see the Delhi, the iconography, when you approach the two houses of Parliament, Parliament and the two, the South Block and North Block, you see there are 4 pillars, which were the 4 dominions that existed in 1927, which the British felt India would be the 5th to aspire for. So this was a sort of a response by the Congress to say we will have responsible government as a dominion. Now, why we never took the dominion status is the subject of an interesting article that has just arrived today by the great historian at Yale, Rohit Day, who has written about why did India not take it with the Nehru report. So I haven't read that yet, but maybe there is a clue in that. So.
What's the journal?
I think it's well. I saw the tweet, and it might be passed, and I can send it to you.
Fred,
So,
we'll see if we can get a copy of that. We'll have a copy of that hopefully here.
Yes.
For people who are interested.
yes, I
We're
think
not-
he just, if you don't mind,
Okay.
one question from him. Because,
Sure. Okay.
He is a U.S. citizen, so
An author Indian, though.
yes.
Two rights.
This will be our last question,
Yes.
I believe, in the interest
Uh,
of time.
Bring it back to your subject. Any law is valid only if it's enforced. Now, who enforces the Constitution? In the United States, is the Supreme Court can do that. Does the Supreme Court of India take a similar role in making sure the constitutional rights are upheld?
Well, thank you very much. We have a former judge here, so I don't want to obviously something that would be. You've probably dealt with cases of enforcement of the Constitution. So our Supreme Court is not the only guardian. In fact, the high courts actually have the power too. And so the enforcement of the rights in terms of writs are with the superior courts, the high courts and Supreme Court. Our Constitution also provides district courts could, if Parliament makes a law, enforce fundamental rights. But I do think that it also is a vigilant people, right, enforcing rights. And I think that is the interesting thing that I take away from a lot of the movements that I see, right? People are standing up for their rights and not really looking to the courts as the only guardians. And so that is sort of my sort of takeaway from what's happening. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raghavan. As I noted, in the interest of time, we'll have to conclude. I know there are a few more pending questions. Perhaps you can find Mr. Raghavan afterward. I'd like to now invoke that great Indian tradition of a vote of thanks. I'd like to thank our Consul General for his time today and your remarks, sir. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all from the audience who are coming here today, many of you for the first time. I hope you'll come back to our American Center. I'd like to thank Lauren Lovelace for her leadership of our public affairs team. Thank you very much. I want to thank my colleagues helping here today, Usha Davalor. Thank you for this great idea for a great program. Wonderful turnout. TGV, the digital team, Daya for helping out. Prem and his team here at the American Center for hosting us here today. And all of the distinguished guests. But of course, Mr. Vikram Raghavan, thank you so much for your time today. It was a very interesting program. Thank you, sir.